Hello, my name is Lauren Cheney, and the country that I chose for my project is Cuba. I'm excited for you guys to get to learn a little bit about it. First of all, I think it's important to understand what disaster management is before specifically talking about Cuba's management plan. So, in order to alleviate some of the damage that disasters cause, many countries develop disaster management systems to help prepare for disasters as well as to make the reconstruction process a little less tedious. According to an article published by the World Confederation for Physical Therapy, disaster management can be defined as the organization and management of resources and responsibilities when dealing with a disaster. Moving on, Cuba does an excellent job of managing disasters and ensuring that their people are well prepared when a disaster arrives. As far as the history of disaster management in Cuba is concerned, the first measures that Cuba ever took in disaster risk management was after the 1959 revolution. Afterwards, in 1962, the People's Defense Structure was established, and then it was transformed into the Civil Defense System in 1966. Later, in 1994, a law was passed that attributed the people who serve as governors and mayors will also be responsible for disaster management and the safety of the people. Since then, there have been many laws enacted in order to keep the country updated on risk management. This is probably one of the main reasons why Cuba is one of the best countries in the world when it comes to disaster risk management. The institution that controls the prevention, response, and recovery of disasters within Cuba is known as the UNDP, which stands for United Nations Development Program. The UNDP endorses the idea that the disaster management should be strengthened at the local level. This shows the bottom-up implementation pattern that Cuba has for disaster management. This means that the country tries to handle things on their own with their own resources before asking for help from the national government. Cuba places a large emphasis on preparing their citizens so that they can do as much as possible before having to ask the national government to step in. Cuba is an island that is located in the Caribbean Sea. Two of the main natural disasters that pose a significant threat to Cuba are hurricanes and earthquakes. As stated in an article published by the ACN, hurricane season in Cuba typically occurs from June 1st to November 30th. During hurricane season, there is often significant rainstorms that can also lead to floods and landslides. In addition, earthquakes have also commonly been reported in Cuba. As a matter of fact, Cuba is located in an active earthquake zone, which means that the movement of the Earth's crust in that area could potentially lead to an earthquake. Although Cuba is in the active earthquake zone, they rarely actually have deadly earthquakes. As a result of this, Cuba spends most of its time and money trying to prepare for hurricanes rather than earthquakes because they are much more frequent, so they pose a greater threat to the country. In Cuba, the local government and the people are the two main groups of people that participate in disaster management, unless there is a massive issue in which the national government would be called upon. There are also NGOs, such as Red Cross, that often come in to help after a disaster strikes in the area. The bottom-up implementation pattern that Cuba uses for disaster management has proved effective for the country. Despite the fact that this pattern works well for Cuba, it may not always be the best plan for other countries, such as countries with the majority of the resources at the national level. As with anything, there are obstacles that arise when trying to develop effective disaster management within a country. Some possible obstacles that commonly hinder the disaster management process within a country are financial deficit, lack of resources, lack of people to help the recovery process, or lack of appropriate tools to reconstruct. In Cuba, however, they have done a good job dealing with most of these things. The main obstacle that Cuba faces when it comes to disaster management is determining what the best processes to implement are. Cuba takes disaster management very seriously, and the people in Cuba also do a good job of implementing what the local officials do and practicing the protocols. A good way to more easily understand the disaster management process that is in place in Cuba is to look at past disasters to see how the country dealt with the issues that came with the disaster and how they have used that to further develop their disaster management system. Due to the fact that hurricanes are the most common threat to Cuba, it makes sense to delve into disasters of that nature. Comparison of two Category 5 hurricanes, one in 1932 called the Hurricane of Santa Cruz del Sur and one in 2017 called Hurricane Irma, that hit Cuba show the development of disaster management in the country. When delving into the circumstances and outcomes of each of the two Category 5 hurricanes, it becomes clear that many developments have been made in the disaster management industry over the years. As stated in an article written by Nigel Hunt, when the hurricane of Santa Cruz del Sur was about to hit, the Cuban government did not do much to prepare its citizens, besides issuing a hurricane warning, which was issued a while later than it should have been. On the other hand, according to Smith, Spark, and Ottman, when Hurricane Irma was about to hit, the Cuban government urged all of its people to evacuate and took precautions to help the people once the storm hits. It should also be noted that the citizens of Cuba who faced the hurricane of Santa Cruz del Sur in 1932 were much less educated about hurricanes and disaster risk management. The citizens of Cuba who faced Hurricane Irma in 2017, however, were much more in the know about all the things that they need to do before the storm and where to go or how to act once the storm hits. At this time, Cuba had also begun extensively preparing its citizens for disaster by both knowledge and action. In 1932, there was not much of a disaster management program in place, so the people were less prepared when they were face to face with a very deadly storm. These two hurricanes show how disaster management has changed over time and how new strategies have been implemented that proved successful. It is known that the new disaster management techniques are more effective because the death toll from Hurricane Irma was a mere 10 people, whereas the death toll from the hurricane of Santa Cruz del Sur was over 3,000 people. The difference in these two numbers is extraordinary and truly shows the difference that disaster management makes. The image in the top left shows the damage from Hurricane Irma, and the picture to the right of it is a picture from the hurricane in 1932. Here's a list of the references that I used throughout this video. So that's the end of my video on Cuba. I hope you learned a lot about the disaster management system that is in place there, and thank you for watching.